Some months ago, we started covering the story of Val Zod's Superman from Earth 2, one of the best versions of the character. And then we stopped because, honestly, the absolute universe was blowing up. So, we are coming back to cover it now. Here's the thing. So, for those of you guys who didn't see our first video, I'll link it down in the playlist so you guys can get caught up. But this initially opens up with Lois Lane talking to Val Zod. Now, why is Lois a robot? Okay, so in the very first issue, and really the very first volume of the New 52 Earth 2, which is what this is, written by Tom Taylor, that Superman was turned into a parademon when Steppenwolf, one of Darkseid's generals, invaded Earth 2. Batman died, and Wonder Woman was killed by Steppenwolf. Things went south fast. And that's like the first issue. That's like issue number 1. It popped off so quick. In volume 4, The Dark Age, which you'll also find in the playlist, Val Zod showed up here on the scene, and Lois Lane returned as Red Tornado. So it's basically her, it's her personality and everything, just in a robot body. But Val Zod being here, right, he had arrived on Earth at one point in time, and we'll kind of talk about that here in a minute. But for the most part, he's a pacifist. He has no desire to fight, and he has lived his life as a recluse. And so that's why he's kind of learning the nature of his powers for the very first time. It's very similar to Flashpoint Superman, for those of you guys who remember that story when DC did the Flashpoint event. And so that's why he's learning things, like he can't shave, and Lois tells him stuff like your invulnerability is increasing. Clark used to shave using heat vision and a mirror, right? I can help you when your heat vision kicks in. Until then, you'll just have to be a bit hairy. So his powers are beginning to manifest in different ways. The problem here is that in the midst of all of this, Superman shows up to Bedlam's science facility. Now, Bedlam and Beguile are basically a couple of agents of Darkseid, and Superman, having returned as basically under the control of Darkseid, is trying to prepare Earth, right, to become the new Apokolips within the DC universe. But Terry Sloan was the one who originally discovered Val Zod and was basically the one that had him living as a recluse. More so than that, Mr. Terrific is here, and one of the things that we had mentioned in the previous video is that Mr. Terrific was yanked into this reality from the main DC universe. So this is not Earth 2 Michael Holt. But what goes on here is Superman is pissed because he wants to know about the Kryptonian. He has learned that Val Zod exists on Earth. And so that's where Bedlam basically says, look, like, we need these guys in order to create a boom tube and move Earth to replace Apokolips. So do not kill them. Besides, I already have the information anyway. And that's what he says, right? The Kryptonian's name is Val Zod. He was sent from Krypton before the planet's destruction, but for some reason he arrived long after you did. Terry Sloan tracked his ship and hid it from view of other monitoring systems as he approached Earth. And so that's where Superman asks, where is he? Right? And Bedlam just says, he was held beneath the Arkham facility, but our forces there reported his cell empty. Someone breached Arkham and took him. Now, within this context, right, Superman is shown basically Aquawoman, right? And that's what Bedlam says. These images were taken by our parademons at Arkham. The woman seems to have incredible strength, and the robot, and that's where Superman just says impossible, right? Because Superman recognizes Batman. Now, he doesn't know who Batman actually is, and we'll talk about that here in a minute because it's kind of a dope bit of storytelling. But Superman realizes Batman's here, but Batman's supposed to be dead. And so one of the things to know when it came to Val Zod being freed is that instead of you having the Justice Society as you traditionally know it, in the New 52 Earth 2, they were called the Wonders of the World. But what ends up happening is they basically arrive to free Aquawoman in order to enlist her for her aid. But then she ties them in to Val Zod. So they end up rescuing Val Zod as well. Now, Aquawoman takes off back to Atlantis, right? But she does agree that if they need her, she will respond to the call. And so for the most part, when it comes to focusing on Val Zod, he kind of starts learning how to use his powers from Lois Lane. And a lot of it's because Lois Lane knew Superman, right? She was in love with him. The two of them had a whole life together. And so in a lot of ways, it's kind of teaching Val Zod what Superman had taught her about how his powers worked. And that's when he gives a bit of an explanation here. Now, something to know is that we do get that over the course of this, right? There's going to be these small moments here and there where we learn the history of his story. And he says, my parents were scientists. My capsule was full of their teachings, and their words were the only words I've heard most of my life. They believed violence was the stupidest way to overcome issues. Hence the reason why he is such a pacifist. And Lois tells him, right, they were right, but you are not fighting today. are you ready? And he just says, I think so. And so she teaches him how to fly, which is dope, right? And he's just like, this is incredible, which it is. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Flight would be an incredible power to have. It would be amazing, assuming that you were also invulnerable and you wouldn't freeze to death if you flew too high up. But ultimately, because it's kind of training wheels and because things are moving relatively fast, right? They kind of have to train him up, right, to get him ready to fight Superman. She just kind of lets him go when he says that he's ready and basically crashes into a tree, but then starts to float of his own accord, right? So kind of learning his powers, the training wheels are coming off, that kind of thing. The problem with this is that Hawkgirl shows up, right? And so she's like, he's not exactly graceful, right? And, Lois Lane's like, I mean, look, he's learning how to fly, right? What are you going to say? The problem with this is that Hawkgirl looks over and realizes all these parademons are flying towards them, and the parademons are being led by Superman. So this is the first encounter between the two, and it's amazing because the parademons go after Lois, right? Hawkgirl does what she can, and then Superman immediately goes after Val Zod and smashes this guy into the ground. And he just says, Darkseid already has a Kryptonian. He has no use for you. And so where he initially goes in for the killing blow, because at this point, Val Zod is exceedingly vulnerable. He's strong and he's capable, but he is not on the same level as Superman, at least not yet. Lois steps in, right, and just says, it's me, right, it's Lois. And for a moment, Superman regains himself, and he's kind of taken by surprise with the whole thing, because in his mind, Lois is dead. Now, as most of you guys know, right, in the world of comic books, Superman and Lois Lane are the 1-2 punch of romantic couples, right? Lois Lane's quite literally the first lady of comics. So at the end of the day, when she shows up on the scene and you have Superman, no matter how twisted he may be, some part of him will start to snap back. And that's what happens, right? He says, like, you died, right? You cannot be Lois. And in fact, the connection between them is seemingly so strong that when the parademons start attacking Lois, Superman incinerates them all, right? Just starts blasting away at every single one of them, and then ultimately grabs Lois and takes off. Because the main priority here, from Lois's perspective, is making sure Val Zod survives. Superman's not going to kill Lois, right? She knows that. Even if she's only in a red tornado body, he's not going to kill her. She's going to be fine. And so ultimately it comes down to Val Zod and Kendra facing off against what remains of the parademons that Superman didn't destroy, and trying to get out of there as fast as possible. But Kendra tries to teach him a very important lesson, right? You have to fight. You can't just sit here and just be attacked constantly because of your pacifist beliefs. That's fine if you choose to do that under any normal circumstances, but while your parents taught you that violence is not always the answer, the reality here is sometimes it is necessary. And so that's where, in the midst of all of this, suddenly the firing stops. And in that moment, Alan Scott arrives on the scene, the Green Lantern. Now, one of the things to specify about Alan Scott within the Earth 2 universe, as he's helping to get Val Zod and Kendra back to their base of operations in Gotham, is that while Alan Scott has the traditional powers of a Green Lantern, the role he plays is actually more akin to Swamp Thing, in the sense that he's a representative of the green, tapping into plant life, different things like that. So there have been ample memes across the internet, right? Earth 2 Alan Scott's basically Captain Planet. But the point remains the same, right? Regardless of what the role is that he plays, his powers are incredible, right? Like pretty much any Green Lantern, he has the ability to create constructs based on nothing more than his imagination. And so that's when you switch over to Batman, right? And the conversation kind of unfolds in this interesting way, because what ends up happening is that Batman kind of looks around and realizes Superman brought an army of parademons here. And he says, there's nothing left in Gotham. So I can only think of one reason why Superman would have brought an army of parademons. But the other part about this is that if he's coming for Batman, and by extension of this new knowledge, Val Zod, then that means he also knows where the cave is. So now their concern becomes, where's Lois? Now, one of the cool things that Lois had done is she had actually given Jimmy Olsen the ability to hack into her systems and to, one, see through her eyes and to hear everything she hears, but number two, to be able to track her location. And so you end up finding out that Superman and Lois have actually traveled to Smallville because Superman's kind of celebrating the fact that Lois is alive and he wants to spend time with his parents. Of course, his parents are kind of horrified by everything that they're seeing, right? The fact that their son has returned as basically a villain and is quite literally cutting a swath through the world, right? Raising Earth in order to prepare it for the arrival of Darkseid and to basically become a new Apokolips. Not only that, because they're able to hear everything Lois is saying, they overhear Superman giving the command to his forces, attack Gotham, destroy the cave, and kill everyone inside. And that's exactly what happens. Parademons invade this place with full force. Warhounds and everything. Red Arrow, Connor Hawke, he dies, right? Like immediately, he gets killed. Sandman shows up, pops a portal, and they all end up jumping to the location of the World Army. Now, for those of you guys who don't know about it, the World Army was formed after the events of the first issue, when pretty much all the superheroes were killed, and the initial invasion by Steppenwolf. Now, where his forces were ultimately felled by the wonders of the world, the fact is, the world had to prepare itself for another potential invasion. So the World Army was formed as a result of that. The other cool thing here is that with this whole facility under attack, the one thing they realize is that Superman and his forces cannot get their hands on anything in here. So they set it to self-destruct, which would basically detonate like a nuclear bomb. And that's what happens. But the funny thing about this is that Alan Scott, in seeing all of this, tells Hawkgirl, stay here, right? I have a plan. And of course, because of his construct, when everything explodes, he and Hawkgirl survive. Now, the funny thing about this is that Alan Scott actually has his own motivation for doing this, which is to say, Alan Scott and Hawkgirl and the Flash Jay Garrick are kind of a team among themselves. They were basically unified due to the events that took place with Alan Scott's origin, the green versus the gray being represented by Solomon Grundy, the idea of the undead. And so they have a very close relationship with one another. Jay Garrick has gone missing, and Alan Scott doesn't know where he is. So it's somewhat of a subplot based on everything else that's going on. But the idea was to capture these two parademons and then send them back to their masters and tell their masters they failed. All the while, tracking them, right? And so that ultimately leads to the liberation of Jay Garrick, the Flash, and him being brought into the fold and returning back to the wonders of the world. But focusing this on Val Zod and Superman, you jump back to when they basically teleport to Amazonia, right? Where the Amazons are. And one of the things about this is that Batman basically starts chastising Val Zod, as you would expect here, right? Because from Batman's perspective, and the way that he explains all of this, is he looks at Val Zod and he says, why didn't you do anything? Right? You could have taken that entire army apart. And where Val Zod starts to speak and saying that he doesn't like violence, the response of Batman, I know, right? You don't like violence. But do you like this, Val? Because this is on you. And he completely blames Val for what had happened with Connor Hawke. Now, is it unreasonable? Yes. But it's also a thing that Val Zod kind of needed to hear, right? When you are talking about a wartime conflict, right? Lives being on the line, there is no room for pacifism, right? If you are a pacifist, people will die. And so in this instance, Batman's teaching him a very moral lesson in his own way. But Batman is not without his own morality faults. And Jimmy Olsen points this out. He goes running up on Batman. It's just like, do you think that was helpful back there, right? He just says, like, I don't have time for this, Jimmy. And Jimmy just says, then make time. And he calls him Thomas Wayne. Now, I will explain that here in a second because it's a really cool bit of history for his character. But he looks back at Jimmy and asks, how do you know that name? And Jimmy just says, please, right? It's why you freed me. I am accountable. I can hack any system. I can basically breathe information. No one can hide from me. And so that's when he says, Lois told you. And he's like, yep, she 100% did. And he says, I know who you are, and I know you're really good at blaming other people for your own mistakes. But what did you do to save Connor? And where Batman kind of stammers, Jimmy says, you could not get your Miraclo formula in time. You couldn't fight back. I accept that. Val couldn't fight either, but he was sure as hell doing what he could to protect us. Frankly, I think someone that powerful choosing a path of nonviolence is pretty amazing. And you being a doctor yelling at someone for actually caring about life is pretty stupid. You want Val to help save the world. We're going to have to find a way for him to do this on his terms. And you are going to have to stop being so damn negative, right? And he says, this world is grim and dark and violent enough without you adding to the angst levels. So let's show Val that this is a planet worth saving. And as he storms off, he just says, seriously, right? I was thinking about being your Robin, but for that to happen, you and I are going to have a very serious talk about your attitude. Now, how is Thomas Wayne Batman? Okay, yes, Bruce Wayne Batman died in the first issue, sacrificing himself to try to stop Steppenwolf and his forces. Within the Earth 2 continuity, Thomas Wayne survived the shooting in the alley and basically just went underground, right? Just kind of keeping an exceedingly low profile while his son operated out there as a superhero. Once Bruce died, Thomas Wayne took up the mantle, one part out of guilt because he was never there for Bruce when Bruce needed him, but also because of a sense of responsibility. But he carries that with him everywhere he goes, but it also kind of makes him a dick. Now, it's also important to understand that this is coming off the heels of the popularity of the Flashpoint comics when it was revealed that in the Flashpoint continuity, Thomas Wayne had become Batman after Bruce was killed in the alley. So again, for a period of time, about, 3 or 4 years, and even going into Tom King's Batman run, the idea of Thomas being Batman was a very popular concept, and rightfully so, because he was dope in Flashpoint. God, he was amazing in Flashpoint. But that's where you get to Jimmy Olsen talking to Val Zod, and this is a very important conversation, because Jimmy asked the question, right, what does it feel like? And Val's just like, the sun? And Jimmy says, yeah. And he says, it feels like a piece of me that was missing. And he just says, I'm sorry about Connor. And Jimmy kind of tells him, right, it's not really your fault. And then where Val Zod goes to talk about Batman, the response of Jimmy, like, do not worry about Batman. The guy has a lot of guilt to throw at other people. But he asks, right, can I ask you a question? And Val Zod says yes. And so Jimmy asks, what are you hiding under that hoodie? And Val Zod just doesn't say anything for a minute and then just says, I'm not hiding anything. And Jimmy just says, look, right, uncovering secrets is kind of what I do. I'm so good at it that I was imprisoned for it, and I have a photographic memory. So I know that you have not taken that thing off once you were around us. Why? And where Val Zod doesn't initially say anything, Jimmy says, it's fine, right? Scowly McBackface is not around to judge you, right? And Val Zod just says he hates me, right? But Jimmy tells him he doesn't really hate you specifically. Batman's just kind of an asshole, to be honest, right? He's just like that around everybody. But he says it's not about him. But that's where he says, right? It's just us. You are going to need a new top anyway. That thing is falling to pieces. And so Val Zod just says, yeah. Okay, and then exposes the Superman symbol under the hood. Now, there's a whole reason why he wears this, so it's kind of dismissive to call it a Superman symbol. There's a whole motivation behind it, and it's really amazing. So what ends up happening here is this. When Val Zod reveals it, he just says, with everything going on, you can see why I hid this. Right? And Jimmy just says, right? I don't get it. Are you related to Superman or something? And the response of Val, no. This is the symbol of the House of El. Lara and Jor-El took me in after my parents tried to speak truth to power, and they were punished for it. His parents were actually executed. Now, I do want to say that there is a one-shot origin comic for Val Zod himself. I'm not going to swear to it, but I think there's a secret origin issue. I'll have to look it up to make sure, that goes into like what happened with his parents, how Val Zod became Val Zod, his connection with Supergirl, the whole 9 yards. But what's cool about this is he says, when Krypton's time had come, Lara and Jor-El saved me. They sent me away with their own child, his cousin, and another. The suit was designed to survive the voyage. I hid the symbol from you because of what it represents on your planet. Kal-El has turned this into a symbol to fear and despise, but I cannot remove it. To do so would be to dishonor the man and woman who took me in and save my life. So it's kind of ironic here. While Superman has become this wildly twisted and sadistic version of the person that he used to be, the reality is that Val Zod falls more in line with what Superman was than what Superman has become. And so that's when Jimmy says, do you think you can stand up to power? Because we really kinda need you to, man. Like, we really need your help in all of this. Because if it comes down to it, they need to know that Val Zod is willing to kill Superman, and he's capable of killing Superman. Now, so the subplot about Green Lantern rescuing Flash is important to a degree because it kind of ties into what's happening now, which is to say, while Green Lantern and Hawkgirl are successful in rescuing the Flash, Beguiler follows them, right? Like, literally keeps tracking them down. And at that point, Jay Garrick attacks Beguiler. And then, as Jay Garrick describes it, he ends up just running so fast that he just like pushes her into infinity. But the reality is, it looks like he just pushes her into the Speed Force. But Beguiler is now out of the picture, but is one of the people that came with Superman Superman, and arguably one of Superman's generals, if you saw it that way, that this means he's going to be pissed. And that's what Batman says, right? When he's talking to Commander Khan, basically the leader of a segment and what's left of the world army, because there's only a few thousand soldiers left, as opposed to the millions who were a part of it before Superman showed up. That's what I mean when I say he raised Earth. Superman killed everybody. It was bonkers. Like, it was nuts when he first showed up here. He just started eradicating everything, right? Batman says Superman is not going to deal with this nicely. He's going to retaliate. So we have to be ready for what comes next. And yes, the world army is a fraction of what it used to be, but the reality here is we are going to need them, because now a plan is being put together. But switching back to Superman, right, out in Smallville, it's very Homelander-esque from the boys when you look at this, because what ends up happening is that where he's really ready to sit down with dinner with like Lois and Martha and Jonathan, that Jonathan's out in the garage working on the truck and doesn't really seem to want to have anything to do with what's going on here. And so Superman just kind of tells him, right, like, come into the house, right? And he phrases it in a way where it's not asking, it's an order, it's a demand, right? He says, come inside and show Lois some hospitality. You and Ma are far too old to be of use when Darkseid comes. Let's enjoy this time together while we have it. And so sitting down at the dinner table, it's this really just twisted, sadistic, and screwed up type of thing, because what happens is Superman asks, right, isn't anyone going to say anything? This feels a little awkward. And Jonathan's just like, no. Right? And Superman just asks, is there a problem? And Jonathan just starts cutting loose. He says, damn straight there's a problem, right? I cannot do this, Martha. I am sick of being afraid. I will not sit here and pretend that my son has not turned into some mass murdering zealot with a dead robot wife. And Superman just says, right, I am a representative of almighty Darkseid, and you will speak to me with respect. And the response of Jonathan, screw Darkseid. And in that moment, Superman kills him. He literally hits him with the Omega Sanction. He kills his own father, Patricide, right? It's bonkers. And Martha's just like, my God, right? And in that moment, Lois is just like, you cannot be, there's no way you're Superman. There's no conceivable way you're Superman. Now, she has been making that argument over all the time since his return. Superman would not do any of this, but everyone's been telling her it is Superman, right? It's just a corrupt, twisted version of him. But in this moment, she's like, you are not Clark. Clark would never kill his own parents. That would never happen. He would storm out, he would be angry, he would scream and shout, even if he was an agent of Darkseid, but there's no way he would use an attack like that and incinerate his own father and turn him to dust. And that's where Clark is just like, do not say that, right? I love you. And like, he starts crying. But in the midst of that, he's contacted by Bedlam, and Bedlam tells him, we have done it. Darkseid can finally have this world. The gateway is ready. We can open a boom tube large enough to move this Earth into New God territory, and it can become the new Apokolips. And that's exactly what happens. With Mr. Terrific and Terry Sloan under the mind control of Bedlam, the boom tube is opened, and then we're off to the races. Because in that moment, the statement is now made, the world's about to be sucked into a boom tube, we have to get to CERN, right? Literally the Great Hadron Collider, and we have to shut it down, because that's where all this is being handled from. Not only that, right, Val Zod is now on a mission to directly confront Superman, because he's shown by Dr. Fate an image of what he needs to see in order to be able to go into the fight in the first place, right? And he's just told, crumbles. Now, he doesn't really know what it means, right? But it is enough for him to say, I understand, I will not kill Kal-El, but I need to fix what he has broken. And so ultimately, he races off, effectively becoming the new Superman. And in that moment, you have Alan Scott out in space, who's basically trying to keep Earth from being pulled into this boom tube, literally pulling on it, right? So I think it's important to specify here, the Green Lantern is using a hard light construct to pull Earth and keep it from being sucked in a boom tube. This may very well be the greatest display of Green Lantern power that I think I've ever seen in DC Comics. It's kind of nuts, right? But where Superman arrives to confront Alan Scott, Val Zod shows up, and the two of them just start trading blows. And it's amazing, right? Because in this fight between the two of them, it's knockdown drag out insofar as Val Zod refuses to fight. Because right now, we're talking about a conflict on two fronts, right? On one side, it's the wonders of the world trying to break into CERN in order to shut down the boom tube and to take out Bedlam. If they take out Bedlam, the boom tube ends, because Bedlam's mind control will no longer work, right? So Mr. Terrific and Terry Sloan go back to their normal selves. On the other hand, you've got Val Zod facing off against Superman. And so Superman says, right, you are stronger than the last time we met. Stand and fight me. And Val Zod says no, right? And Superman's just like, fight me, you sniveling coward. And the response of Val Zod, shut up. Right? I get it. We all get it, right? Violence, death, rage. Damn, you are boring. And he just says, I do not want to fight you. And Superman tells him, right, you are afraid. But the response of Val Zod, I am not afraid. I'm just a better person than you are, right? I do not want to fight you, but I also will not let you stop my friends from saving the world. And that's when Superman realizes they're at CERN and they're getting ready to try to shut down the boom tube, something he didn't know about before, right? And so when he takes off, Val Zod says, right, he contacts Jimmy and says, Superman is heading to Geneva, right? And so that's where Jimmy just says, understood, I have someone on the way to intercept. Lois shows up here, the one person that Superman will listen to, right, just long enough to catch his attention, right? And Superman tells her, move out of my way, Lois. And Lois just says, or what, right? I go the same way as Jonathan Kent. Are you going to destroy me too? And Superman says, I would never, right? And she says, then stop this, right? Stop fighting us. If you really are who you say you are, then let us save our world. And Superman just asks, right, do you really think it's that simple? And Lois just says, a part of me hopes it could be, and a part of me is just stalling. Because in that moment, Val Zod swoops in, bam, and then like takes Superman down. And so Superman, of course, grabs Val Zod and just says, you, right, why are you wearing my symbol, right? And that's where Val Zod says, why are you? I knew your mother. She wore this symbol. Do you think that she would be proud of you? Do you really think that she could even look you in your freakish glowing eyes after what you've done? And Superman just bam, just hammers this guy into the ground. At that moment, this just huge wave just cascades in every direction, knocking down everyone who's near it. And in that moment, the Flash sees it and is like, well, there's our opening. So he looks to Aquawoman, right, and just says, look, I'll have to carry you in there, and I'm sorry, but like, there's really no dignified way to do this, right? So he just like grabs her and races in directly to where Bedlam and them are at. And Aquawoman just looks directly at Bedlam, and Bedlam in turn reads her mind and just says, there is so much strength in you. I will take you. But then suddenly it cuts off, and he says, I can't feel your mind anymore, right? Why can't I? And then he just passes out. And so Batman's just kind of like, what in the heck happened? Because Mr. Miracle, Scott Free, right? Michael Holt, Mr. Terrific, Terry Sloan, they all start reverting to their normal selves, right? They start shutting down the boom tube. It all just kind of goes away. So basically Earth is now saved at this point. And so that's where Alan Scott asks, like, what did you do to Bedlam? And she's like, I moved a large amount of cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles of his brain. And that's where Batman's just like, so hydrocephalus, right? And Jay Garrick's like, English guys, I have no clue what that means. And Batman's like, she gave him a stroke. She made a god stroke out. And that's one of the dopest things that I think I've ever heard. So at that point, we jump back to Superman and to Val Zod. And that's a crazy thing, is because when Alan Scott says there's still the threat of Superman, these two guys are going at it. But what's crazy is in this moment, Superman starts to say, right, how are you stronger than me? What is going on? And then Superman literally starts falling apart. And Val Zod is just like, what's wrong with you, right? And Superman's just like, what did you do, right? And Val Zod just says, nothing. I didn't do anything. And Superman starts freaking out, right? What did you do to me? And Val Zod just tells him, stop, right? Stop attacking me. But Superman keeps attacking him anyway, but then continues to fade away, to literally fall apart. And that's where Val Zod is like, don't you understand? You're making it worse. You're falling apart. There is something wrong with you, Superman. And that's when Lois arrives on the scene and says, it's not. That is not Superman. And it never was. And Superman just kind of looks over and just says, me am. And that's where Lois says, it just thinks it is Superman. Everything you've done in his name, the death, the pain. And Superman just says, Lois, me am Superman. And Lois says, no, right? You are a sick perversion. Clark could never be turned into you. And that's where Val Zod sees this and just says, crumbles. Because Lois says, the world is too dark and too ugly with you in it. Go away. And literally just blows what's left of Superman, and the dust just settles. And that's it, right? this guy is dead on the spot. And so in that moment, Flash looks over, right? And he says, Bedlam's gone, right? And I guess even a god recovers from a stroke pretty quickly, but then they also realize that he's taken Mr. Terrific and Terry Sloan as well. So now these two guys are still back under his control. And these are two of the brightest minds in the entirety of this universe. Terry Sloan is native to it. And again, Michael Holt was pulled into it. And so Flash is like, we won, right? And Alan's like, yeah. And so Flash is just like, I mean, now what? And that's where Alan Scott just says, we clean up here, right? And then we rid the Earth of what's left of Apokolips's forces. And so we take back our world. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end because Val Zod is officially part of the wonders of the world now. This is how he becomes a part of the team. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.